Let's welcome Sid Dobrin, professor at the University of Florida. Sid is professor and chair of the Department of English. His research addresses blue humanities and blue ecocriticism and digital humanities. He is the author and editor of numerous books, including AI and Writing, Blue Ecocriticism and the Oceanic Imperative, and Fishing Gone, Saving the Ocean Through Sports Fishing. Welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Let me get these things turned on. Wow, thanks. I am thrilled to be here. I want to thank Béné and Maureen for bringing me here today. It's an honor to be here, and it is also an honor to be sharing the keynote with some other very influential scholars. Béné Meillon's environmental humanities work is just fantastic, but I have to say it's his work in sound studies that really opened my eyes to thinking about things like what happened to the oceans during COVID and when the shipping channels shut down. And I'm sorry Melody's not going to be here, but Wild Blue Media is just an incredible book, a way of thinking about materiality and ocean. And of course, Serpil sitting over here, who is one of the leading thinkers in blue humanities. I am very grateful for all of their work and how it's influenced mine, and the opportunity then to hear from them, hopefully with Melody's recording. So I wanted to say thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to let me talk about ocean. I realized in preparing for this talk today that as much work as I do in ocean, I don't know anything about the French relationship to ocean, or very much about the Mediterranean in this part of the world. So I did my research. I watched the definitive film. Well, so I now feel confident talking to a French audience about ocean. If you haven't seen it, so that said, I actually want to start my talk today in a different kind of a place, a different kind of way of thinking about ocean, particularly as what I'm going to try to do today is work in concepts of the post-human into how we understand ocean. And I want to start off by thinking about the hyperocean. And here I want to clarify, I'm not talking about hyper-sea that's theorized by Mark and Diana McNamon. This is hyperocean, and I want to think of it more akin to the hyperreal and Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality. I got to say that I want to start here. Florida is not home to big waves, yet we have this incredible surfing culture. There are really only a handful of places in Florida where surfing happens, and it doesn't happen all the time. The conditions have to be right. Yet we've got this surf culture. And that includes things like surf shops and t-shirts and tattoos and all of those kinds of trappings of a commodified culture. So we also have our surfing legends, our celebrities. And this is a picture of Kelly Slater. My brothers and I grew up watching Kelly Slater as teenagers, and he's just a few years older than I am, win 11 surfing national championships. And Kelly had this idea 10 years after he retired that he wanted to create the perfect wave, which is what all surfers are always looking for, right? So using a technology that he developed based on waves in the lower trestles of California, Oahu, Hawaii, and an undisclosed location in Micronesia in the Marshall Islands, Slater set out to create the perfect wave. This is a short video of the wave. Now, the wave, it's called Kelly Slater Wave Company, and it's a groundbreaking innovation that uses a 100-ton foil that's dragged through the water. They simply call it the vehicle. And it runs along a track above the water. It's a bidirectional foil that creates right-handed waves in one direction and left-handed waves in another direction. It's basically an inefficient boat hull. The displacement is greater than the buoyancy. Now, the technology can create head-high, over-the-shoulder, perfect waves. But this perfect wave, what I really want to get to in this slide, because I've said all these things already, is that in order to surf the perfect wave, it costs about $50,000 a day, or $70,000 a day during high season. The perfect wave is clearly a commodity here in this way. It sits about 100 miles away from the California coast, so not in the ocean. And the surfers who actually use it and train on it say that you're treated to this very unusual opportunity, the ability to surf not in the ocean, but in a pool with a perfect wave. But they have serious problems with it. And the problems are that surfers who surf the perfect wave make very clear that if you learn to surf on the perfect wave, you can't surf in the ocean. Because there's no such thing as the perfect wave. Every single wave is always inherently different. They also note that there's a lack of personal connection to the perfect wave. That surfers spend a lot of time surfing because of that connection. Would you agree? Surfers sitting here. So, that is, many claim that Slater's wave is not real, but it's something other than the real, what we might take up as the hyperreal. So invoking this concept of hyperreality, taken from post-structuralist thought regarding processes of transforming perceptions of reality, which leads to cultural states of confusion between signs and symbols that are used to represent or stand in for reality, and thus influence perceptions of consensus reality, surfers acknowledge that this wave is not just a fantastic relationship between technology, but that Slater's wave and the very notion of what constitutes the real ocean become very problematic. So I want to start here today with Slater's wave as an analog for thinking about the dynamic relationships between experience in, on, and under ocean, and the representations of those experiences in terms of technology and human and non-human, and ultimately the post-human. So as I've said, I am intrigued by the technology of Slater's wave, but my eco-critical and eco-compositional, environmental humanities, blue humanities ways of thinking about things wonder about the experience of Slater's perfect wave when we place it in dialogue with something like Karen Ingersoll's consideration of indigenous waves in her fantastic book, Waves of Knowing. And I want to ask the question, can there be the perfect wave? So when Béné asked me to come speak today, she asked me that I bring together my experiences in, on, and under ocean, and the ways in which my experiences contribute to how and why I wrote Blue Ecocriticism and my current work in Blue Humanities. Now you have to understand that with the exception of the 2 years after I completed my PhD at the University of South Florida, I was an assistant professor at the University of Kansas. And that was the first time in my entire life that I had lived anywhere but the edge of the ocean. In communities that are literally soaked by the narratives and images of ocean. But I have to say, even in saying that, even Kansas is haunted by the ghost of the crustaceous western interior sea. The memories of the ancient sea manifest in the teeth of megalodon and other oceanic fossils found along the muddy riverbanks and in the rich soils of the tilled fields of America's wheat belt. I had friends that used to go out and walk the rivers when they would go down, and you just dig through the mud for these giant megalodon teeth. It was just absolutely fantastic. And you're in dead center of the continent. So it's just a reminder that, you know, it was all ocean at one point. So where I live, and where I have lived most of my life, The emblems on t-shirts, company logos, bumper stickers, billboards, television commercials, music, manhole covers, sports teams, the legends, the lore, all are dominated by depictions of ocean and ocean iconography. Ocean saturates the places of my life. While I would love to sit here and reminisce about all the ways my life has been defined by ocean, I'd like to keep this talk less about the personal, though it's going to become clear that's almost impossible when we talk about human relationship with ocean. And I want to focus more on, shall we say, a critical ocean engagement, which is really just a nice way of saying more academic stuff. So I have to say, too, that the complexity and the size of oceanic matters means that my talk today will remain primarily at the surface, rather than a lot of deep dives to unpack the kinds of things I'm getting at. And I have to note about this picture that I snapped about 2 weeks ago, and let me see if I can do the conversion right. I was 45 meters down, so pretty darn deep. So we're not going to go deep today. Diving into how we think about cultural imaginaries and social imaginations in our understanding of the ocean requires that the object of our inquiry, no matter what we identify as text, and we got to remember that John Fiske taught us already how to read beach and ocean as text, that the text we consider must be engaged in a more fluid approach than we tend to grant our analysis of terrestrial text, and that the history of literary analysis, or more than the history of literary analysis and eco-criticism, have taught us in the past. Such engagements demand attention as well to the function in the text of cultural memories as more than nostalgic recollections, but as core components of cultural imaginary formation. As Isabel McNeill explains, this is a form of memory that is not confined to the body of an individual, but is instead mediated through cultural artifacts and imaginative investment. Such memory then accumulates and circulates as embodied memory and as augmented memory. The very texts that co-constitute cultural imaginaries function in material forms of augmented memory. The books, the films, the art, the music, and so on function as forms of augmented memory that contribute to our cultural imaginary and cultural memory of ocean that then form how we know ocean. Those t-shirts, those tote bags, art, posters, bumper stickers, books, pirate stories, literary text, tattoos, and so on, all function as cultural memory apparatus and archive while simultaneously serving as an economic device, products for sale, rendering cultural imaginaries inseparable from economy. So a Finding Nemo plush toy is at once a result of capitalist economics, an artifact that preserves and is also an artifact that preserves and contributes to a cultural imaginary, a memory augmentation that curates, circulates, and perpetuates cultural memory of the Disney film and the functions of that film within cultural memory and cultural imaginary, and thus part of the formation of how we know ocean. In this case, an anthropomorphized rendering that constructs a particular way of knowing ocean, removed from ocean itself, yet deeply influential in how we construct the narratives of information, lore, myth, and so on. Now I gotta pause here because in the session, the first session today, when Greg and Margarita were talking about orcas, fantastic session. Those of you who missed it, wow, you missed something good. But it reminded me of a story tied that I think I can tie to this point. About, it's gotta be 15, 20 years ago now, I got a phone call from a lawyer asking me to serve as a professional witness in a case against SeaWorld because a guy, turned out a heroin addict of a guy, climbed the wall at SeaWorld, snuck in, decided to strip naked and jump into, I think it was Tillamook's tank, but to one of the orca tanks. And the orca killed him. And when they found him, much as Greg was describing a baby being carried around on the nose of an orca, they found the body of this guy being carried around by whichever of the orcas killed him. When the lawyer called me, they wanted me to testify that SeaWorld was at fault here because they had created an image of the orca to be a playful, cheerful kind of animal that would do tricks on command and such. And my response to the lawyer was, you know they're called killer whales. So needless to say, I turned down the opportunity here. But I think that, you know, this is why the naming, how we project into the cultural memory this notion of what, you know, a clownfish is. By the way, if a clownfish weighed 20 pounds, I'd never dive again. The most aggressive things in the water. And yet Disney makes it out to be the cutest, most cuddly thing in the world. So just a quick aside there about my concept here. That cultural construction changed that guy's perception of, I can get into, well, the heroin probably had something to do with it, get into an orca tank and swim around with the orca tank. So back to the Nemo toy. Such artifacts are not manifestations of memory, but are themselves memories, semiotic mnemonics to connect text and imagery. It's not just that the text evoke memory or preserve memory, they are the memory and the augmentation of an embodied memory. So for me, such textual encounters intertwine with life encumbered by, or more accurately, enhanced by, ocean. As a teenager, my friends and I navigated the rivers, bays, and open water around our homes that fed the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean in small powerboats and sailboats. By car, you couldn't get anywhere without crossing several bridges across rivers and bays. The shores were dominated by shipbuilding facilities, docks, recreational marinas, and most of my friends and I had either or wanted four-wheel drives for accessing remote parts of the beach where nobody else could get to find better surfing and fishing spots. And then my family's history of boat making and fishing placed ocean as a central figure in our lives, along the fact that every single person in my family is an academic. So our home sat a foot above sea level, less than 3 miles from the main gate of the world's largest naval base. The entire region is flaunted and flaunts its military and maritime histories, and it's exemplified in its collective moniker, Tidewater. Throughout high school, I worked at a marina at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, internalizing the narratives of boaters, boat builders, commercial and industrial fishers, recreational anglers, and commercial captains, learning maritime folklore and learning maritime technology. For my brothers and me, teenage social life revolved around surf culture, fishing culture, beach culture, and beach parties, which to us were just parties. Boats, fishing, all of that was just standard operating procedure. My academic life has been balanced with secondary careers as a boat captain, a scuba instructor. I write for fishing magazines. I advocate for ocean conservation and fisheries policy at the federal level. Mine is, as I have said, a life of ocean, and the title of my talk today alludes to the fact that I am most comfortable in, on, and under the water. Now, a good deal of the exigency for my talk today, as well as my other work in Blue Humanities and Blue Ecocriticism, derives from Dan Brayton's venture that eco-critical scholarship strives to represent the human impact of the biophysical environment, yet even the most encompassing efforts to expand the parameters of eco-criticism have neglected the central significance of the ocean and maritime life. I would put the period there, but because Dan's book is Shakespeare's Ocean, I have to add the literary Shakespeare thing. As my colleague Terry will tell you, I am not the most literary of guys, so when Shakespeare comes up, I'll just defer that to Dan. In a rudimentary way, then, how I speak about ocean intends to call attention to this neglect and emphasize the need to expand the Blue Humanities lens to more attentive inclusions of both matters oceanic, given both the tremendous corpus of literary and textual representations of ocean that contribute to cultural imaginaries and the vital role of ocean in global ecologies and environmental crises. That is, my work is a matter of ocean, in matters of ocean, is at once an attempt to emphasize and the significantly overlooked importance of ocean in humanities work, and to call to question the critical and ecological functionings of doing so. So of course, I want to understand how the methodologies and agendas of Blue Ecocriticism and Blue Humanities might provoke further conversation about ocean. So to do so, I need then to look at the reflexive humanities, to situate Blue Humanities in a larger context and to situate some provocations about ocean. So I'm going to set the ocean aside for a moment and talk about blue humanities as an academic enterprise. So I want to talk about reflexive humanities and blue humanities. In 2008, across several articles in the New York Times and some other areas of publication, Stanley Fish, in his ongoing consideration of the state of higher education, takes up the question of what use are the humanities? And of course, he responds to his own question by answering, the only honest answer is none whatsoever. He explains, though, and it is an answer that brings honor to its subject. Justification, after all, confers value on an activity from a perspective outside its performance. An activity that cannot be justified is an activity that refuses to regard itself as instrumental to some larger good. The humanities are their own good. There is nothing more to say, and anything that is said diminishes the object of its supposed praise. However, Vicky Traumenhauser says this about Fish's claim. Fish's small concession in the intrinsic pleasures of the human, we'll cure that with water. Water cures everything. Fish's small concession of the intrinsic pleasures of the humanities bring to those who practice them is a slim peg on which to hang an entire tradition of intellectual inquiry, and at the same time appears suspiciously cozy with the pressures of the very market forces from which he seeks to protect humanities departments. Importantly, too, Traumenhauser explains that part of the crisis in the humanities to which Fish is responding encompasses fears of the steady erosion of disciplinary integrity that have fueled efforts to rediscover specialization and to reorganize the humanities study processes in its own particular techne or skill sets. So what Fish attempts to do in his claim of the value of the humanities emanates from within the humanities themselves, is to resist the idea that the value of the humanities can be determined by anyone outside of the humanities. Yet his claim is complicated because, as he points out, the value of academic disciplines has become valued in terms of their connection to commodity and capital worth beyond the academy. But as Traumenhauser explains, Fish too hastily dismisses the possibility that humanities might provide a sustained inquiry into the value of their own endeavors. Traumenhauser instead turns to the work of historian Roger Griffin, who posits a need for a reflexive humanities that do the work of accounting for their own activities and methods. Griffin proposes a need for a self-reflexive, mindful approach to the humanities work, which Traumenhauser rightfully characterizes as presenting necessary corrections to the under-examined and hubristic practices of early generation humanities. Now, Traumenhauser and Griffin forwarded their notion of the reflexive humanities about 2 decades ago, but the term's being revitalized within the growing context of the humanities divisions that have emerged over the last few years. For example, and I apologize, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong here, Samyukata Research Foundation, which promotes research and publication in established and emerging areas of liberal humanities, has encouraged significant work in the reflexive humanities. And according to the SRF, it is widely accepted that the term humanism has a protean nature, shifting from time to time. Historically, humanism has been used to describe various philosophical categories, different schools of thought, and even opposing ways of life. However, rational scrutiny and individual moral autonomy are widely accepted as its defining characteristics in the present century. By extension, the term humanities refers to a hermeneutics of culture, mostly in the academic world. To project this nature of humanities as historical conditioning with strong epistemological foundations, the SRF proposed the term reflexive humanities. It is reflexive in the sense that it reflects on its own nature, implying a critical sensibility, continuously refining and reforming basic premises. So for the SRF, the reflexive humanities provide an opportunity to test new waters in academic research, employing the time-honored tools of critical theory, historicism, cultural studies, and so on in innovation and sometimes daring ways. The focus of the reflexive humanities then falls to emerging divisions of the humanities, and we know these things coming out: blue humanities, environmental humanities, digital humanities, energy humanities, urban humanities. And I'm actually working on a project right now that it's called the Humanities Division, and it's why we're dividing the humanities up in STEM-related modifying ways. Each of the ways now humanities works to define itself is to modify a STEM kind of program there. Now, while my work is influenced by reflexive humanities, it's not inherently a reflexive humanities project. This is because in order to engage in the emerging and nascent divisions within humanities, such as blue humanities, the politics of not letting those outside the humanities determine the value, methods, purposes, and objectives of the humanities seems to contribute to maintaining specific core attributes of the humanities than it does to rethinking the very reason for and need for those values in the first place. That is, while the reflexive humanities appear to be right-minded in expressing a need for self-reflexivity, current research as to how that reflexivity might function seems to maintain an endorsement for traditional humanities values rather than resituating those values in contemporary context or even eliminating them altogether. The rhetorics of outside and inside the discipline as forming the perspectives through which reflexivity might be achieved necessarily needs to be multidisciplinary, not just humanities-centric, in order for any possibility of transcending or disrupting traditional disciplinary siloing to unfold. The entrenched legacy systems in logic and epistemologies in the humanities, while historically useful, resist substantial revision and struggle to adapt to new contexts, particularly aquatic contexts, for which adapting humanistic terrestrial linear ways of thinking appear to either trap marine or other aquatic environments and text in pre-established traditions of critique. The system of ethics derived from these legacies cannot continue unmodified, particularly as we work to establish and validate the very notion of blue humanities by framing attention to ocean within pre-established academic patterns. Let me give an analog to that real quick, just as I'm thinking about this. One of the first books I wrote, I made the argument that true radical feminism would never work in higher education, because the Institute of Higher Education is inherently structured around a patriarchal system, which means that in order for radical feminism to either come into academia, it's either going to have to completely dismantle higher education, and we know the power of that institution, or it's going to be anesthetized to where it can be tolerated by that structure. We see the same kind of thing with any kind of far to the edge radicalism. Radical environmentalism cannot be tolerated by higher ed because it is inherently a questioning of higher ed. And so that institutional structure will either push it out or will adapt it, make it its own, but within its own vision of what that kind of radical environmentalism can be. So when we start talking about what happens in the blue humanities, the fact that we're talking about it that way is inherently talking about it in an academic framework, which automatically limits how we can talk about it, right? So as such, we can begin to see the seams as to where blue humanities or any other reflexive humanities is unfolding inextricably bound to the legacies of academic humanities. Thus, one of the challenges in rethinking the humanities is balancing the perspective of foundational epistemologies, which define and unify the discipline, with the development of new epistemologies that may not fully align with these traditional legacy epistemologies, assumptions, and practices. That is, one of the most difficult aspects of rethinking the humanities from within structures emerging in the new humanities divisions like blue humanities is that the humanities may no longer be the humanities upon which reflexivity can shed any light. For me, one of the rich opportunities of the blue humanities, blue ecocriticism, oceanic studies, or whatever we're going to call this recently invigorated attention to ocean and human interaction, is the opportunity to dissolve many of the traditions that have siloed the humanities in what kinds of work can and should be done and understood as humanistic. So nearly 30 years ago, which I hate admitting, I gave my first ASLE talk, and it was called Water, Water Everywhere, but Not a Drop to Drink, Resisting Traditions of Drink and Fish. And then 2 years later, I gave a talk at another conference called The Pelagic Writer Toward a Discourse of Fluidity. And for the last 30 years, my oceanic mindedness has been trying to break away from the linearity and solidity, not just of land-based thinking, but of human-centric approaches to ecocritical work. With this in mind, I want to wrap up this maelstrom of a talk by offering a few provocations that have been on my mind lately and have been fueling my writing about ocean that I'm currently engaging with by asking, why human? I said at the beginning of this talk that much of my thinking about ocean these days is tied to my thinking about the post-human and post-humanities. So let me offer 3 ocean provocations tied to post-humanities. First, I think we all understand that one of the foundational tenets of posthumanism is a critical challenge to anthropocentric perspectives, a rethinking of the agency, intrinsic value of non-human entities, including marine life, a perspective that calls for an ethical framework that respects the rights and agencies of marine organisms and ecosystems, an ethical system that is nonetheless human in origin. I've been reading a lot lately about Professor Teresa Vincente's successful campaign to grant Mar Menor the rights of personhood, and the debates that are going on in Europe to grant crustaceans with the same rights as mammals. And while these moves will likely have a positive impact on protecting Mar Menor and the, quote, rights of certain non-human others, I'm concerned that the foundational position is to make others, be they ocean or crab, or anything else for that matter, something more like the human. That personhood and rights are the basis on which values are established. This leads me to wonder about the ultimate value of establishing blue ecocriticism, blue humanities, environmental humanities, and so on as the common denominator in these kind of academic pursuits. As my colleague Bron Taylor said to me recently when I told him I was working on a book in the blue humanities, he said, "Does ocean really need humanities?" Yet, in asking these questions, I want to be cautious not to discount the value of human interaction with ocean. How, for example, do we account for indigenous relationships with ocean and the narratives of those relationships in meaningful ways without reinforcing positions of human primacy? And how do we account for the agency of so many humans connected to ocean for who they themselves have only recently been granted agency or are continued to be denied agency? And in that same breath, how do we account for the politics of ascribing agency rather than indigenous agency or ecological agency? Does the mud crab need our declaration of agency to validate its ecological niche? In that way, how do we establish value for ocean outside of the human value, outside of human value systems? That is, unlike fishes of what use are the humanities response, the only honest answer is none whatsoever, we have to rethink the very idea of value as a method for critiquing and the willingness to resist the legacy epistemologies that have guided the humanities as an academic position. Second, many versions of posthumanism highlight complex systems in which all entities inhabit. This view is crucial for understanding the oceanic dynamic, interconnected ecosystems that humans are a part of, not separate from. So how then do we account for the complexity of ocean, and can we? I've been writing about complexity theory for nearly a decade, and the only answer or glimpse at possible answers I find for these particular questions fall into the third part of my provocation, and that's technology. Posthumanism often involves rethinking the role of technology in human and non-human interactions. In thinking about ocean, this raises questions about the use and impact of technologies such as deep sea mining, marine biotechnologies, and remote sensing tools. Given that many of the technologies we use to better know ocean are the same technologies we employ to better exploit ocean. These are the same technologies that fuel extraction economies and petroculture that have also given rise to consideration of energy humanities. There must be a critical examination of how technological intervention affects marine environments and the ethical implications of deploying such technologies. Ensuring responsible use that prioritizes the health of marine ecosystems and avoids unforeseen detrimental effects must be paramount. But it's not just these evident technologies, right? The AUVs, the ROVs, the satellites, the remote sensing, the acoustic technologies, the genomics and biotech, and so on. It's also the technologies of representation and the rhetorical velocity at which we now circulate information, that we circulate knowing. That leads me to this. This is one more provocation that I feel like I need to convey about my presentation today, particularly in thinking about how we come to know ocean through technology. And this is a subject I'd like to speak about at length, and we kind of got into it at the first session this morning just a little bit, and I'd love to talk more about this, but In addition to my work in blue humanities or environmental humanities, I work in digital humanities. And over the last, 14, 15 months, I have delivered over 70 keynotes around the world about artificial intelligence. And so I feel like I need to confess to you that of the 30 images that I have shown you today, all but 5 were AI generated, most last night. The reason I bring this up is that those images now contribute to cultural memory of various oceanic places. Not just in my displaying them here, but because of the platforms, the no-code, low-code platforms I use to create them, they are now part of the large language model data sets for when somebody else creates an image about ocean, what I have done now contributes to how that will generate information about ocean. These are the kinds of technological questions that we need to be taking up in addition to those more evident observational technologies of what is GIS teaching us? Or what does it mean that there's a plastic bag at the bottom of Mariana's Trench? Well, what does it mean that I just keynoted an entire a conference on ocean education and sold you on artificial images of ocean as authentic? I'll leave it at that. Questions, concerns, comments, critiques, cabbages, whatever it is.
Let's see. Questions?
And can I grab the mic then on the way? I'm the conference organizer, just grab it. I'll open the questions. I was wondering, Sidney, so there's something you didn't mention, but I think we all know that you revealed that this ocean deficit disorder that you take up after Dan Brayton coined it is based also on your study that only 2% of the articles that have been published in IOM between 2010 and 2020 dealt with oceanic matters. So I really, really want to thank you and underline how important that book, which you very humbly didn't talk about very much today, but Blue Ecocriticism, which is a wonderful book and really pioneered a whole branch of ecocriticism. I have 2 questions for you. One of them is, what are you doing when you're talking about ocean, not the ocean with an article and with a lowercase o, but Sid talks about ocean with a capital O and without an article? So that's my first question. And my second question is, do you think that maybe, some of us are doing phytopoetics, I'm looking at Heather Sullivan, some of us are doing zoopoetics, maybe in some of the questions and reticence that you have, I'm thinking that maybe those fields, blue phytopoetics, blue zoopoetics, might be some of the ways to tackle, to try and do what we're trying to do, right? Knowing the limits of what we're trying to do. So it's
Yeah, I'm going to answer your first question very easily because you gave me the answer when you gave your opening remarks that scientifically most people who work in oceanography and related fields are in agreement that it's one body of water, right? And so rather than putting the article of the, meaning that this is a specific one, that I'm just talking about ocean writ large. And I'd like to problematize that a little bit too, because even in how people are talking about blue humanities these days, there's also a distinction between whether blue is signifying ocean or is blue just signifying water. And so the folks working in water studies are doing something that's a little more scientifically focused than a lot of people in blue humanities. But as I point out in the book, the water is all moving, and it's not a thing that can be, we demarcate it for political reasons. Oh, this is this ocean, and that's this ocean, and here's the EEZ, and all this stuff. But it's all moving through fissures, and it's not water being held in a bowl. But my work is strictly, let's just say it's marine, it's saltwater, just because that's where my experience is. I get creeped out by lakes. The water's not moving. There's something wrong, right? And I don't really know rivers that we have lots of rivers where we live because they're feeding the ocean. We live where I live, it's all karst topography. It's all limestone. And at the Okefenokee Swamp, the water all drops down, comes through the aquifer and is filtered and comes bubbling up in these gem clear springs that then run into the Gulf or into the Atlantic. But other than that, I don't know anything about rivers, and like I said, Nessie's in the lakes, man. But so that really the first is, that's how I see people starting to acknowledge that we're talking about one thing. So, and then the second question about the other, this is a tricky question because, well, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm trying to put together, Grace, you didn't show up, did you? Grace was supposed to be here today from Routledge. I'm putting together the Routledge handbook on blue humanities. And one of the questions is, can I keep it just salt water? But then even if I keep it salt water, do I need a microbiologist over here? Do I need somebody who does paleontology and the ancient seas that are now here? How do you start breaking this thing down into all these little tiny bits? And even with that kind of a complexity, I'm all in favor of, take the word blue and sock it in front of whatever you've been writing about for the rest of the previous part of your career. I'm going to now do blue paleontology, or I'm going to now do blue ecofeminism, or I'm going to do blue, because we haven't been talking about ocean. The whole reason I counted all those articles in ISLE was I wanted to see, have we actually been talking? We haven't been, which is just astounding to me. So I don't know. And on the one hand, do you make yourself too niche? And I also have political issues here too, right, or academic political issues. I don't know what it's like here in France or Spain or in England, but we're facing a situation in the US where a good part of our tenure and promotion or our post-tenure review is being based on citation indexing and impact analytics. And I'll give a quick example. I had a colleague who was up for a fellowship, and the fellowship people came back and said, this guy's only had 10 citations from his articles. And I literally responded, that's fantastic, there are only 8 people in the field. But they don't see it that way. And so I worry that if we encourage, write about these really minutiae, it's important for the learning process, but there are other impacts that are going to affect that, because you write that article, 8 people are going to read it, right? So, yes, Richard.
Can I come back to that challenge at the end of your talk?
Yes.
About the way that you had generated these images using AI. And you suggested that made them inauthentic.
Not necessarily inauthentic, but a different kind of mediation is what I'm
right. I mean, I'd like to bring that out, because
yeah.
what I heard from you was a very categorical distinction between the authentic and the inauthentic. And I suppose one way of responding to that would be to ask where the IA got the material from. And presumably it got them from other images that already existed, just as AI is trained using everybody's books,
right.
Much to the rage of the authors. Right. And in that sense, I don't know, I mean, you talk about memory and the construction of memory. Now, we know that memory isn't authentic in that strict sense as well, don't we? We know that the images inside our heads are not direct mediations of whatever it was we were trying to remember. So in that sense, the notion of authenticity is simply endlessly elusive, isn't it? It's never graspable. So, I mean, again, I suppose I apologise because this isn't particularly a question about the ocean, but why should one be concerned about this question about authenticity?
So I actually don't think you should, but what it does is it invigorates a very important kind of question about mediation, memory, and so on.
Yes.
So whenever I talk about AI images, the first thing I point out is I do not understand why we have operated with this idea of picture it didn't happen or photographic evidence, because the moment we invented photography, we invented image manipulation, right? And I've got this database of hundreds of images that most people, if I showed them, you would acknowledge them and know exactly what they were in the historical moment. And then I'll show you the original, because they've all been edited and changed. And so our cultural memory of things like the flag raising at Iwo Jima, or the Bobby Kennedy salute, or all these, or the Kent State shooting, all of those images were manipulated. And the reason that I bring it up is because we accept those as part of our cultural memory. Even if we weren't alive at the moment to see that. That's how that, and this ups the ante in that game. I can now, the opening slide with the plastic, AI generated. The fish on the beach, AI generated. What it opens up is the ability for someone, anyone, to now create the mediated representation. And for us in the US right now, the ongoing conversation is about the election and how AI is going to manipulate the election by creating deep fake and all that. So what I'm really getting at, and it may not be authenticity in the larger scope of how we think of authenticity, but the representation of something that's closer to reality, right? But it's never been there. That's why I provoke with that. We got to think about what this is going to do. So all those images of the beautiful beach, those places don't exist, but they made me want to go there. Is that getting at what you're?
Yeah, I guess it is, and I suppose part of what you're saying, especially in relation to the elections, is what is the apparatus for checking them? Where is the critical intelligence coming into play?
That's the big question.
And this, of course, paradoxically, is a possible future role for the humanities, enhanced rather than diminished.
Right, well, it is, except we're seeing some other tributary kinds of arguments against, particularly from artists, particularly from information designer. It is a deeply problematic kind of approach, but the fact now that anybody can do this opens up the doors for really interesting questions about, I literally could go back to my room right now, initiate a campaign about, it was Gladys was the orca, right? Or I could initiate a campaign about industrial harvest and have a bot generate these images and keep turning them out on social media, keep turning out, because the way that these platforms work is they're looking for patterns that repeat the most frequently from which to borrow. That elevates that in the distribution and the rhetorical velocity, and without that critical inquiry moment, I could very easily create a campaign that, pick a target, but it's political, environmental, and and make it look like reality. And people like my mother will go, oh, look. So that's where my concern comes in, and thus the provocation.
I think we have time for one last question, so you choose.
Arlene, you win.
Hi, Sid. Thank you for the talk. Thank you very much. I am going to sort of piggyback off what Richard brought up, but I'm interested in nostalgia. I'm interested if that's a point of, and I realize how slippery the notion of authenticity is. I'm thinking, for some reason, the photo of you before you were 20 up there reminded me a lot of, if you remember the plot of Fahrenheit 451, with people who are older, who are dying, telling a younger person the book they had memorized, because books were being burned, as 451 is the temperature of burning books. I thought, will there be a sort of person crying in the wilderness of AI, and looking for an unmediated image, an unmediated experience, because, and this is a larger topic obviously, there are dangers in mediated images to some degree.
Well, my first response, Arlene, is there is no such thing as a non-mediated image, but because somebody had to make the image, and in making an image, you are mediating. The second part of that is you're asking me to make a prediction, and when it comes to AI, I make neither predictions nor promises, just provocations. So that's dangerous. That's like, before COVID, making an economic prediction and then wham, everything you've said, goes out the door. I do not know if there's going to be that person shouting in the dark or not. A lot of that has to do with much larger cultural constructions and cultural changes. And a lot of times I find, and I get quoted a lot for saying nostalgia is dumb, but I find that also there's something dangerous in falling back to the way it was better. And I really have a problem with that. So I don't want to say that I'm up here being an evangelist for more AI for everything. I mean, I'm very cautious about it. And we also have to acknowledge that the term AI is a massive umbrella term for doing a lot of different things, not just content creation or data analysis. It can be used for all, it is not it's a lot of things. So I don't know. And the real problem with that question has nothing to do with how you're asking the question. It's that we've only been having this conversation, or the world has only been having this conversation for 16 months, right? I mean, AI has been around for 50 plus years, but it was sort of siloed away from the majority conversation. But in November 2022, when OpenAI dropped ChatGPT, now everybody has access and the ability to make stuff. That changes the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Sidney, for your presentation.